Now, President Cyril Ramaphosa will address the nation tonight about government's response to the second wave of COVID-19 infections in South Africa. So what must the president take into account tonight? I'm joined now by political economist at Bukindaba Group, Mr. Cyril Mkhize. Good to have you with us this afternoon, Mr. Mkhize. Now, we've heard the president saying that the second wave of COVID-19 will not bode well on the economy. If you could just elaborate on that for us.
Well, I think what the president is saying is there are very critical measures which were taken in March and April, which drained or took a lot from the fiscus to try to shore up the economy that it doesn't collapse. And also there were critical instruments that doesn't come out every day from Treasury as well as the SAP, the South African Reserve Bank, on your interest rate adjustments here and there so that they support the banking system to keep the liquidity within the system. So now with the third quarter slightly recovering better than the second quarter, we were hoping that we'd be seeing the back of the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, if it comes back, it's going to be finding a very drained fiscus, and it's going to be finding a very small room for maneuver, in particular for Treasury, in terms of doing budgets, reallocations, and as well as there's going to be small room for maneuver, in particular for the Reserve Bank, in terms of playing the question of adjusting interest rates to support liquidity flow within the financial system. So I think that's what it means, that it's going to be quite harsh than the first lockdown.
We did see a 13.5% rebound in GDP. What impact does that have, if any, at this particular time?
Well, it's very important, Tammy, in a sense that you're seeing in a very difficult space some positivity from your manufacturing, from your trade, as well as, interesting enough, from the export in the fruits, as well as the export of the maize, because the rain has been quite favorable to us. So you are now seeing an internal reboosting of the economy itself, not necessarily through stimulation, but it's also coming in a difficult time where other sectors, which is your tourism, which is your, a number of sectors, construction and so on, are still a little bit lagging behind. Even though we trust that construction is going to kick in within the next 12 months or so, because the government recovery program is obviously going to be spearheaded through that massive built industry drive, which is your infrastructure program, and a lot of budgets have been put there. So we are confident, but we're looking at a small marginal number, which is going to be a 2%, if you will, talking 2021, 2022, which is not a big number. But compared to other emerging economies and the other economies which we are in BRICS, save for China, your Brazil, your Russia, your India, South Africa is kind of rebounding much, much better in terms of numbers in comparison to our BRICS counterpart.
No, certainly the numbers in comparison are relatively low, but looking at our own territory, the growth has really been exponential over the past few days, if you look at the number of COVID-19 cases. But with that in mind, what are the economic aspects, the economic issues that the president ought to keep in mind today as he makes his address? How does he balance the two?
I think the biggest thing that the president has to balance is the question that has been asked by a lot of development economists, that are we in the recovery economic scenario, or are we in the growth scenario, or are we going to have to mix both? Because the two trajectories will actually look at two different things. When you're talking growth, you can't talk growth without really saving certain industries. So you have to have a very strong element of recovery, which means you'll have to have a very strong state-backed program of actually funding and being deliberate about going to pick up those industries that are really fledgling. Mind you that we already went into the lockdown having been hit by a technical recession, a stagnant growth, and rising unemployment. So within this year alone, 3 papers have come forward from 2 from the Ministry of Finance, and actually 4, 2 from the Ministry of Finance and 2 from the President. If you're going to add this one, it's going to be the 3rd. So we don't want jumping economic solutions, but we want economic solutions that are going to keep track with some of the things that have already been identified. For instance, the whole ICT interconnected network was one of the things that were identified as the economic drivers of this new growth/recovery phase. And that shouldn't be abandoned for a new policy direction. So at this point in time, I'm expecting the president to actually do say what sort of, even if it's softer stimulus packages, not just only in the built industry, infrastructure sector, but even in other sectors that are going to be looked at as new drivers of growth. And also, he spoke at length about bringing in the youth, that youth energy, the youth ideas that are supposed to come on board. There could be probably new suggestions and new innovations that really need the backing of the state, so that even if there are industries that will be shrinking, but we're going to have new industries that are going to be supporting employment and shoring up growth.
One thing for sure, Israel, is the fact that this is not going to be a Christmas like any other. Traditionally, how much of an economic impact does this particular time of the year have on the economy, and what impact will that loss of economic activity actually have on the country's economic recovery?
Well, when you look at the economy, you obviously look at it from the eye of the economic cycle. Economies obviously work with the booms and the busts. Usually the festive season, or as well as the Easter season, which are your high travel, high interconnected, high consumer-based, consumer-driven seasons, they usually do so well for the economy. In particular, when you're talking on the general spending of the consumer and the collection of the state, in particular on roads, because there's a lot of influx within provinces, and also when you look at your retail sector. Your retail sector really does so well during this space because people want to go and buy consumables and home consumption goods, and also tourism itself. People want to travel and go on holiday. So you see a very huge spin usually on the 4th quarter, which obviously reflects on the 1st quarter of the next year. Now, with this pandemic, that is hitting on 2 major important things for this season, which is traveling as well as mass gathering. You're obviously going to see a huge knock on consumer products and a huge knock on the transport sector, or a huge knock on the tourism sector, which obviously when you come into the numbers of the 1st quarter in 2021, it's not going to be looking good. But what I'm happy to hear today were the numbers that came from Eskom, that even if there's still difficulties as far as managing the debt, I mean, obviously their finance structure is the balance sheet is highly constructed around leverage. But what I'm happy to hear was that there was some profitability, and they've got some decent level of cash to manage the working capital demands within the institution. So that tells me that you might find a little bit lower load shedding within this particular period, which is another factor that usually hits a little bit hard on the question of the remuneration, particularly on your restaurant and manufacturing, which reflect obviously on the 1st quarter of the year. So it's quite an intricate balance, but we have to save lives, I suppose. A livelihood at this point in time, or lives becomes more of a priority than the economy. Can resuscitate the economy, but lives are obviously of critical importance, but it's very difficult.
No, it certainly is. Thank you so much for your insight and your commentary this afternoon. That's a political economist, Mr. Israel Mkhize.